Stephanie here. I wanted to do a video in response to a question that Denise had in the group. She used the template and followed the videos and created her first paper bag. Yay, Denise! That's exciting. She got it from Amazon and received it in the mail, and she says it looks good. She just had one question, and it's about font size. And she's concerned that her font size may be a little larger than it should be. And what would I recommend for 6x9? All right, for 6x9, now there's a couple of considerations when we're talking about fonts. So let's just, I'm thinking out loud as we go, so this may be a bit jumbled, but when trying to decide what font and font size you need, the first thing you need to do is what is your trim size. All right, so we know that Denise said her trim size is 6x9, which is a little larger than most. Average book size, 6x9 is actually a very popular size for indie authors. My preference is 5x8. Some authors will do 5¼ by 8 and 5½ by 8½. So 6x9 is good if you maybe have 100K, if your word count is 100K or more. But I do have a book that's like 105K, and I still set it to 5x9, and I believe it's about 400 pages, and that's using a pretty decent font size. So when considering what font size you need, think about your trim size. Then next, what is your word count? All right, so your word count and your trim size are going to play together. So of course, the higher your word count is, the more pages your book is. The bigger your trim size, the less pages your book is. The lower your trim size, the more pages your book is. So those two factors play together. And then also too, what is your genre? That can play a factor into your font size. And who is your target market? If you write in an area where maybe the majority of your readers are older, you definitely want a larger font size. All right, so that's something to consider. Now, my general rule, I'm just going to kind of give you my rules, what I typically do. For a 5x8 trim size with around 50 to 100K word count, I typically let's do one more thing here. What is your page count goal? All right, because that can be a factor as well. Do you want a larger book so it looks more substantial, or do you want to get that page count down? Okay. All right, so let's go back to this. For a 5x8 trim size, 50 to 100K, my target font size is around 11 points. All right, I will go as low as 10 points, but I typically will not go above 11 points. Now, something to consider, not all fonts are created equal. And that's where we're going to look at. This is the sample book that I'm creating. I haven't finished it yet, but I hope to finish it over the next couple of weeks. And this will give you a good idea of fonts and font sizes, what you think looks nice. This is going to be a 6x9 book, but I'm also going to do a 5x8 as well as a 5½ by 8½, just to give everybody a good idea of how it looks and what size you want your margins for that particular size, and what font size and line spacing as well. All right, so in this book, the majority of the pages that I have decorated like these, the font sizes are going to be 12. And I believe I have my grid set up to be 15 or 16. 15, okay. And we'll talk about the grid, which is also very similar to your leading right here. They're almost the same. I won't get into the specifics of it right now, but we will once I finish all the videos for the new series. I will hopefully have an episode that talks about the grid and compare it to what the leading is. All right. So we've got 15. Our grid is 15 points. Leading is 15 points. The font size is 12. Now this font is Athleus. I think it is an Adobe Typekit font. It's an Adobe font that I have. I have a huge, from many, many years ago, I have a huge collection from Adobe that was several $1,000s of fonts, high-end fonts. And I use these religiously because I have the rights to them, and they're not, most of them are part of Typekit now, but back then Typekit didn't exist, but it was a great resource to have of fonts, but I don't think they offer it anymore. So a lot of the fonts that I use are from that CD that I bought many, many years ago. All right, so this is 12-point Athleus, and this is a 6x9 book. All right, now this is Adobe Garamond, the same 12-point. It's very similar to Athleus. This is probably what you could call a normal 12-point font. However, here comes Bookmania. Bookmania is also set to 12-point, but it looks much larger than Garamond and Athleus. And when I get into, I'm going to have an entire episode in our new program on fonts and font sizes, because a font at 12-point in one font is going to look totally different in size compared to a font in 12-point in another font. All right, I hope that makes sense. So not all fonts are created equal at 12-point, and this is case in point right here. This is a 12-point font as well, but it looks larger. So going back to our list, what font are you using? Okay, so because Bookmania is pretty big at 12-point, I would be okay with going down to a 10-point Bookmania if I was doing a 5x8 book. Okay, here's another one. This is Esprit. This is the font that I use for all my own novels. This is probably my favorite font. It's a little bit more of a modern serif font, and it looks superb in print. Like Bookmania, it is a little bit larger than like the Garamonds and the Caslons. All right, so that's something to consider. And then here's another one. This is Caslon. This is a great font if you're doing like historical books, because it is a very old school kind of font. A lot of books from the earlier centuries, 17th, 18th century, maybe not quite that early, I'd have to look it up, but this font was designed after this guy, Caslon. He actually created the original, and so this gives you that old school look. So when picking fonts, that's a good way to think about your book, is what kind of book is it? Is it more historical or is it contemporary? So if it was historical, Caslon and even Garamond are great fonts to choose. And then if you were more of a contemporary, some of the newer serif fonts, Bookmania is a good one. Now, this may not look great on screen, but it prints out exceptionally for POD. And then ITC Esprit looks good on print as well as the screen. So I know you may think, oh, that's just too bold, but this looks superb in print when printed with POD. All right, so that was Caslon. Let's look at this one. This is Electra, which is a pretty popular font in the world of traditionally published books. A lot of books use Electra. It's a little bit tighter than most fonts. but it still looks good in print. And it can be for contemporary or for older fonts because it does have a slight older appearance to it. And then this one right here is Warnock Pro. If you have a client who insists on using something like Times New Roman, Warnock Pro is a great option to use instead. And it prints very well in POD. Now, when I say prints well in POD, that's why you'll definitely want to order the sample book when I get it done, because you'll be able to see how these print, because they look a little different when printed than on screen. All right, this is Arno Pro, which is another great replacement for Times New Roman, and it's a little bit smaller than Warnock Pro. So it's more in the Garamond Caslon range. So even at 12 point, it would be smaller than the other ones. All right, and Bakersfield Old Face. I'm just going to quickly go through this until I get to the one I'm mentioning. Book Antiqua is similar to Book Mania, where it doesn't look as good on screen, but boy, does this font print beautifully on POD. And Book Mania is actually one of those fonts that's provided with Word. And Book Antiqua. Book Mania is through Adobe Typekit, but Book Antiqua is on most computers and is actually a very good font to use because it does print so good. Here's another one, Adobe Jensen Pro. It's a little smaller like your Arno Pro and your Warnock Pro. And then here is Bookman Old Style. This is 12 point, but it looks huge. All right, and then here's another one. This is 12 point. This is Californian. It looks small compared to your Bookman Old Style. And there's one, I think it's Libra. I'm just going to quickly scroll through these until I find, here we go. This is Libra Baskerville. This is 12 point, but yet it looks almost like it's a 16 point. So for this font, I could probably even go down to 9 because it is such a big font. So when considering what font to choose, what font size, those are some of the things that we need to think about, all right? So what is your trim size? What is your word count? What is your genre? What is your target market? What is your page count goal? And what font are you using? This will help determine what your font sizes are. All right, so 5x8 trim size, 50 to 100 word count. I generally use 11 points. I will go as small as 10 points. And in some cases, if it's a 5x8 book, and it's maybe 40K words, and my goal is to expand the page count, I'll do that with an adjustment to the margins, and then I will go 12 points with probably a 16 point line spacing or 16 point baseline. All right, and we'll talk about a general rule for line spacing in a minute. All right, so, I cannot type this morning. It's backing. All right, so this is a 5x8. All right, let's talk about 5.5 by, let's skip to an 6x9 trim size. 50 to 100K word count. Again, I generally shoot for 11 points, especially if it's 100K. All right, if it's 50K, then I may go to 12 points. In some cases, if it's well over 100K, I will use 10 points if it's one of those smaller fonts. And if it is one of those larger fonts. So like Bookmania, I could probably do 12 point. 10 point, and that's only if I have a large page count and the author really wanted a smaller a larger word count and the author wanted a smaller page count. All right. So those are a couple of things to consider when trying to determine what point size you want. Now, one thing I recommend when you're in the beginning phases of designing your book is play around with a couple of options and a couple of point sizes and print those pages. So you can go export it to a PDF is how I typically like to do it. And let me pull up something here. Max Rhymes, that's nothing. I'm trying to pull up a recent book that I just did, but these are all, let's do this one. Okay, I'm getting ready to redo this one. Now this is a 5x8. So if we look at our page size, it's 5.13 by 825. So this is 5x8 with a bleed because we have these ribbons that go to the edges. This font is ITC Esprit. This is a young adult book, and this was about 50,000 words, I think, at the end. I don't remember exactly. And I prefer to have books be a pretty substantial looking. So this book wound up being 316 pages, and it's only 50K. So it's 5x8. I don't remember. I think this is 11 point with a 15 point line spacing. We'll look at it real quick. Sorry, let's see. Maryville book. Nope. Book 1. Interior. Okay. Going to worry about trying to find where my graphics are. All right, so this is 11 point. Let's check our grid with a 15 point grid. And this is young adult. So typically with young adult, you can go a little bit bigger. Unless it's like a young adult fantasy, then you may want to go a little bit smaller. So this is probably the largest I would go on a 5x8 such as this. I wouldn't really go any bigger than 11 point. And this actually looks really good printed. You can generally count how many lines are on the page. Your goal should anywhere be between 26 lines to about 32 lines. If you're doing a 6x9 and you have a smaller grid, you can definitely increase that if you have a large word count. So there's just a couple of things to consider. But this is 11 point, and it probably looks a little big when printed, but it's good. It's a young adult. It's okay. If this was contemporary, I probably would have bumped the font size down a little bit. So those are just some things to consider. All right, so if you were doing a book if your target market was mainly seniors, you definitely want to do a 6x9 book with probably a 14 point font or higher. 14 to 16 is probably good if you are doing kind of more of a larger print edition. So that's something to think about. So I hope that helps. I'm working on one of the first episodes that I'm doing in my new program, and it is going to be specifically talking about all things related to fonts. So we're going to go over this kind of stuff in that episode. We're also going to talk about line spacing or the grid. The general rule for line spacing, and this is all for novels, line spacing rule is you want your line spacing or grid. They're very, very similar. They're not exact though, so that's something to know. You want your line spacing to be 3 to 5 point sizes larger than your font size. So if you have an 11 point font, your line spacing should be 14 to 16. All right, so in some situations, if your goal is to increase your page count, You can go lower. Would I ever do an 11-point font with a 13-point grid? No, there's just not enough space there. And some of the letters would just run together. So always use, at a minimum, 3 points larger than your font size. Whereas the maximum of 5 points, you can go up to 6 points depending on the book. In one of the books I'm working on now for a client, she wanted to use a sans serif font, and we can do a larger line spacing with a sans serif font. And actually, you want a larger line spacing with a sans serif font because it helps with readability. All right, so I hope that's helped. That's a couple of tips. One more thing is your indent. What should your indent be? The general rule is that your indent should be the same as your font size. So if you're using a 12-point font, your indent should be 12 points, which equals to, I think it's 1667 or something like that. I don't remember. You can, in InDesign, you can type in your indent. You can type it in right here. You can say, I want a 12-point indent, and that, yeah, 1667. All right, and that creates that indent. But in our template, I have 0.25 for the indent. So you can use 0.25 as well. I would not do anything higher than 1/4 of an inch for your indent. I see people who will format books in Word and they keep their indent to 1/2 inch, which is way too much. So the general typography rule is that your indent should be the same as your font size. However, in some situations, you can keep it at 1/4 of an inch. For ebooks, ebooks work a little bit differently. In EPUB, if you keep your indents to be 0.25, they'll look just fine in an EPUB. But a 0.25 indent in a Kindle or Mobi is barely a space. So when doing ebooks, I always convert that indent in InDesign to 1/2 inch just for the ebook only. And then I will go in and change the indent in the CSS to be 1 EM or 1.5 EM. EMs work better for ebooks, and especially for EPUBs and Mobis, to get that indent to look the same, you should use EMs. Mobis or Kindles, they're really bad. They don't follow some of the normal typography rules related to web design. It doesn't display things the proper way, so we have to improvise and use things that it will understand better. And EMs work much better in Mobis than point sizes. So I hope that answers your question. It's kind of a loaded question if you can't tell, but just think about these kind of things, what your end goal is. And if you're not sure, feel free to post something in the group saying, I'm using a 6x9. My genre is contemporary romance. My word count is 75K. My target market is just your normal contemporary romance people of all ages. Your page count goal you're open to, but you would like a thicker book maybe. And what font you'd like to use, or if you want suggestions for your font, that's fine. Just post it in the group and I'll give you a couple of options to try, including fonts that are available through Adobe Typekit. So I'll tell you, here, try this font at this size with this line spacing. So I hope that helps. If anybody has any questions about it, just let me know. Happy Monday.